Hello and welcome to a brand new build. In today's video, you have no doubt guessed, I'm going to be painting a model of Shadowheart from Baldurs Gate 3. Up to now, I have painted Lae'zel and Karlach, both models that I'm incredibly happy with. They sit very proudly amongst my collection. Incidentally, both videos are on the channel if you have any interest in watching them. But Shadowheart is going to fill out the female half of the core 6 characters from Baldurs Gate 3, the other 3 being Astarion, Will and Gale. It is very much my intention to paint those models as well, because I have long loved the idea of having a full adventuring party represented in my collection in one way, shape or form. Previously, before I painted models, it was very difficult to achieve that, right? You know, I always have wanted it. It's something that I've wanted since I played Final Fantasy, but it's always been incredibly difficult to achieve based on, I assume, manufacturers picking the most popular characters to make it cost effective for them, etc, etc. So you would get maybe a hero, a villain and a random side character, whichever one was the most popular, and that would basically be your scope of options in terms of actually getting collectibles, if you are somebody that likes doing that. However, now, in a world in which I do paint models, I can actually have a full cast of characters represented because the availability of these things is incredible now. And so I can actually build, at long last, this sort of little dream of mine, this little wish of having a full adventuring party in front of me in my house. And so Baldurs Gate 3 seemed the obvious choice because I truly love the game and, I still play it now. It's one of those games where you can fall in love with so many characters in that game, and it seemed the perfect choice for the sort of full party treatment. So the model itself, another incredible piece of work from Warrior Prince 3D. I'm going to be honest here, right? Lae'zel and Karlach were really nice models, really, really nice, very high quality, incredible sort of attention to detail, and, they stand, like I say, really proudly amongst my collection. There is something special about Shadowheart. There is something different. As I look at her now, she is the perfect representation of this model. There is literally nothing to clean up. I have thoroughly inspected it. It is an immaculate version of the model. The texturing is incredibly high detail. There is such sort of intricate line work across the robes and the armor. Her face is so particularly detailed. It's really beautiful. And that is all credit to the printer. So like I say, Warrior Prince 3D, if you have any interest in model making, I highly recommend that you check them out because they do brilliant work. This project has a very unique choice at the beginning. The rest of the models, it's just been put the bits together, paint. Whereas this comes with a choice. For those of you that know Shadowheart as a character, she goes on a fairly unique arc during the adventure, and I'm not going to go into spoilers, but there are 2 versions of her, right? The beginning, or the first sort of 2/3, she has a very grim visage, a very dark kind of persona, if you like. And that is reflected in her physical appearance. So her hair is dark, she has this sort of circlet type thing around her forehead that represents her piety and things like that. And then she's generally wearing full plate mail. But because it is the early part of the game and the way these things work in terms of progression, she has a kind of almost like a corrupted cleric kind of look in which the Dark Justicia armor is beaten and battered and worn, and the colours are muted and the armour is dented and stuff like that. It doesn't have a polished look to it. However, in the final act of the game, if you sort of perform certain actions during the story, there's almost like this redemption version of her at the end, in which she has a cleaner look. Her hair becomes white or silvery white, and generally speaking, by that point in the game, the armor is much more polished, much shinier, much cleaner, and so she has a sort of more benevolent kind of holy appearance, typical with high clerics and paladins. At this point in time, I have not decided which way I'm going to go. I enjoy the idea of both. There's something about the darker version of her that is quite appealing to me. I think there was a desperation in that version of Shadowheart that I really enjoyed, and I would love to have that represented in the model. However, I think that, like I say, that almost paladin-like version of her from the latter half of the game, would stand really brilliantly amongst my collection. And so I'm a little torn at this point in time, but thankfully I'm in the position where I've got a little bit of prep work to do before I get to the point where I'm putting base colours on anyway. So at this point, I don't have to make that decision. But yes, as always, it is going to be a job of putting that black primer down, creating myself a sturdy base so that I can sort of, begin work on the metal work, etc., to begin this project. But I truly think if I'm able to do a good job here, there is a very special model waiting for me at the end of this. I think because of the nature of the model, because of how dynamically posed she is, because of the quality of the print, the texture work, and the detail, I think this could be a real showstopper in my collection. I think she could be really quite special. And yeah, much like always, I'm just keen to get started. So I'm going to go get everything set up to do some spray painting, and yeah, I'll talk to you in a bit. So I've come across a little bit of a unique problem. I've swapped the kind of base primer that I use just to sort of try and find something that's a little less sheeny for future projects. But during the spray painting process, 90% of it has gone on really well. Like, it looks really nice and it's got a better finish than what I had before. But I don't know whether it was because it was an incredibly hot day when I was spraying, or whether I maybe hadn't shaken the can enough or something. But I ended up on one or two of the pieces with this fine sort of chalky layer over the top of the model, which I have mostly been able to clean off. But I do think it's going to affect the texturing a little bit later on. So I'm going to carry on doing my base colours, but yeah, not sure whether that's going to be a little bit of an issue. So this is where we're at currently. I'm very happy, very, very happy with how she's looking so far. The colours have gone on really nicely over the top of the black primer. Issues aside, I actually prefer it as a base because it doesn't have as much of a sheen to it. So I think, generally speaking, I go for sort of quite a muted palette, almost like slightly desaturated, just to sort of give it a more kind of grimy, realistic look. And when I say it, I mean model making in general. Like, my models, I like to have a very kind of like grounded feel to them rather than sort of like hyper bright colours, unless it's appropriate. But this black spray paint gives a good base so that I'm actually able to do that quite easily, which is really, really good. Other than that, the colours have gone on wonderfully. You know, it's the same set of paints that I've been using for a good long while now, and you know, they're fantastic. So the colours are taking to the model really nicely. Couple of quick things. I think I've decided what I would like to do with her. I think I'm going to do the Sharon version of Shadowheart, so the dark hair with the little circlet thing. I think I'd like to do that with her. because I think just because it's such an action pose and such a sort of like a battle ready pose, I'd like to potentially make her sort of appear as though she is actively in combat, if you know what I mean. She's fighting an enemy or whatever. And I thought it might be fun to maybe do it as part of the Goblin Camp encounter in Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3. As a result, I have this gigantic shield that is part of the piece. Obviously no base colours on it yet, but I have this, and I thought it might be cool because I need to double check some reference. I'm going purely off of memory here. I'm fairly sure there is a shield that is a very similar shape to this that you can actually get quite early on in the game that has the sort of the symbol, the icon of the Absolute painted on the front of the shield in blood. And I thought that would be really cool. Obviously I'm going to have to look at reference and stuff like that to see whether or not it's something that's going to look right. But obviously I can paint the base colours on this anyway, regardless of all the metalwork and woodwork to kind of get the shield where it needs to be. But I thought that might be really cool, and then again, to sort of like replicate that encounter, it's a very grimy kind of, you know, it's a messy fight in that sort of arena, if you like. And so I think I'm actually going to have Shadowheart be quite dinged up. So I'm going to make her armour look a lot muckier than it currently is, with some sort of like brown washes and things like that to really knock the colours down. I'm going to dust over some kind of earthen colours to make it look like the fabrics are a bit less perfect, etc. Do my normal dry brushing to kind of accentuate textures, and then go to town on the blood work. Just because, for anybody who's played Baldur's Gate 3, you know, once you've been through an encounter or the characters are bloodied, you know, that actually takes an effect on their physical appearance. You know, they look beaten and like they've been through a hard fight and all of that kind of stuff. And I just thought with Shadowheart being in such an action-ready pose, it might be fun to do that with her. So I'm going to have a look at some reference for the shield, see if I can find anything sort of that verifies the memory that I have of this absolute sort of like shield thing. But otherwise, I've got a couple of the bits to base colour before I can move on to details. So normally, at this point in the project, I would obviously, you know, review what it is I've done and sort of the details that I have managed to put into the model and all of that kind of stuff. But it's always a bit of a funny point in the project because I want to show her off and I want to sort of show what I've done. But if I do, it kind of ruins the last point of the video, like the reveal, right? So it's sort of, it's a bit of a bizarre position in the project. But instead, I thought I would talk a little bit about a slightly more personal side to this project. For anybody who's been watching me for a while, you'll know that I'm cataloguing these model builds and these sort of I'm making memories out of them, if you like. And so, normally as part of a review for the project, I try and kind of talk a little bit about what happened in my life sort of during the experience, or, for example, during Karlach, I was very positive about how I was trying to change things for myself, I was exercising more, etc., etc. This project has catalogued a very difficult period of time. I have very much struggled with my mental health. For those of you that have followed me since the beginning of this, you'll know. But for anybody that hasn't, I have CPTSD. And sometimes it can, for want of a better word, flare up and be very disruptive. I get very anxious, very panicky, very, distressed, I suppose is probably a good word to use. But it happened during this build, this Shadowheart build. And I think it's one of those things that obviously honesty has always sort of been something that I've tried to kind of convey during these builds. And, I feel like the ultimate kind of way of doing that is speaking the truth about how I felt during a particular build. I've really enjoyed working on Shadowheart, but there have been significant obstacles in the way, and a lot of them mental health related. I think to anybody who does suffer with mental health problems, and especially things like depression or anxiety or any of that, sometimes something as simple as just doing what you love can be very difficult. It feels like an impassable, insurmountable obstacle. And I have absolutely dealt with it during this project. There have been weeks that have gone by where I just haven't touched her because I've come into the room, I've sat down, I've set up, I've got cameras ready, I've got the computer on ready to edit the bits of footage that I record, paintbrushes are cleaned and ready to go, and then I just sit there for a bit, waiting for inspiration to actually strike, waiting for the motivation to pick up a brush and, begin painting. And the few times that I've managed to kind of like break through that barrier and actually apply paint to the model have been some of the happier moments in the past couple of weeks, month or so. But it's a difficult thing to do, and I suppose I don't want to waffle on too much about sort of the ins and outs of my mental health struggles. They are very real, diagnosed, and all the rest of it. But I suppose if there's any message that I could kind of apply to this little segment here, keep sitting at the table. Keep sitting in front of the thing that makes you feel good. One day you will pick up the brush and start painting. And, that's when the good feeling comes. Just keep sitting in front of the thing that you love. Keep approaching it. Keep returning to it. Because you'll break the barrier eventually. And it will matter in the long run. Being able to look at something that you've either made or done or, whatever the case it may be, whatever the hobby it is that you've done, whatever you've achieved, it will add meaning to the darker moments in your life, and it's worth sitting in front of your passions and just keep trying. But yeah, I just felt like that was an important thing to add as part of the project because it happened. And, I think these things are important to say. So in some incredibly similar circumstances to how this project begun, it is about 1,000 degrees outside. It is so hot today, and this little tiny studio space is stuffy as all hell. So apologies if there's a lot of this during the course of this review. But I have obviously finished the model. I am at the end of the project once again, and it hasn't been the easiest. This has been a real roller coaster for me. Like I say, sort of, just before this, obviously it's been 2 or 3 days since I said it, but you've just seen it. I have had a fair amount of obstacles during this. I've had to overcome a fair amount of obstacles during this particular project, and I'm glad I did to a certain extent. I am happy with how the project has turned out, and I'm really pleased that my state of mind hasn't kind of come across in the final job that I have done here. But yeah, it's been a hard project. I think previous to this sort of Lae'zel and Karlach, I felt like I was really in my stride. I felt like I was, at the top of my game, I suppose, for want of a better explanation. And that hasn't been the case here. I've really had to overcome some things to sort of get through this project. But enough of that. Let's talk about the model. Again, I'm really happy with how she's turned out. I'm really, really pleased. Obviously, there was a couple of things. I chose to go for the Sharon version of Shadowheart just because I wanted that grimy feel for her, and I think I've definitely achieved that with what I've done. The shield, I think what I actually did in the end was I mixed up 2 shields in my head from the game. So very, very, very early on in the game, there is a big shield that you can get, I believe, for fighting and defeating the goblins outside of the grove when you first kind of approach that location. And it's a series of, it's about the same sort of size, it's, dimensionally it's very similar, but it's basically a series of planks of wood with the Absolute logo smeared on it in blood. So nowhere near kind of as elegant as this particular shield design. But then later in the game, I think there is the opportunity to get Ketheric Thorm's shield, and that has an almost identical silhouette to this, but has a purple handprint in the middle of the shield. So I think somewhere along the line, I have just kind of jumbled those 2 together and thought of Ketheric Thorm's silhouette plus the kind of smeared design of the Absolute logo on the front. So in the end, I decided to keep the shield very plain, because I think what it's actually allowed me to do is when I've come to doing the blood spatter and stuff, it pops off of the shield. It looks a little bit more obvious. So it allows her to look a bit more battle-hardened and sort of like she's been in a tussle, because the red really jumps off of the kind of more plain material that the shield is made of. Other than that, a lot of it has just sort of come together as a result of the dry brushing, the washes, and the texturing sort of work that I do towards the end. Like I say, I was determined for her armour not to look as shiny as Lae'zel. Lae'zel has a very kind of chrome-like armour, and it's sort of garish almost in terms of like how it appears. And I was very determined for Shadowheart to not look like that. There's a ceremonial kind of quality to Lae'zel, in which sort of like their armour is their pride, if you like. It's a representation of them as Githyanki, whereas for Shadowheart, I feel like her clothing and her armour should sort of represent the struggle that she's had to get where she is. And so I was really adamant that I didn't want her armour to shimmer in the same way. Obviously, it's very decorative, and it sort of looks very pretty. But I wanted to make sure that I'd knocked back that sort of shininess, like I say, to keep her grounded. And I just did that by dry brushing over with a few different colours. So I started with a very dark brown that seemed to do almost nothing. But then I tried out a series of different browns where basically they kind of knocked the glitteriness out of the silver and kind of covered it in almost like a fine dusty layer, and really achieved the look that I was going for. I'm really, really pleased. I think some favourite parts for me, I'm really pleased with what I did with the face. I think the face turned out so well. and I think it was just a matter of I mixed the perfect colour for her lips and the scar, so that nothing looked like it was jumping off of her. It kind of ended up appearing very natural. And it did take me a few attempts to get there. You know, I did have to kind of trial and error mixing in different pinks to kind of like the skin texture to try and get something that appeared a little bit more muted rather than just sort of like big pink lips kind of thing. But I think because of that, I was able to really acquire a strong amount of detail in that particular part of her. And obviously I went for the Batman eyes, like the just the solid white eyes. And I think they look very striking, especially when you sort of angle her in such a way as she's just peering over the top of the shield. I think it looks really, really cool. The rest of it, obviously, I've peppered it with like little designs in terms of like the blood spatter and things like that, trying to kind of emulate that look that they get in the game when they've been through a hard encounter and they're kind of like peppered with like just blood spatter and stuff like that. I've tried to give her that so she looks a little bit more rough and ready, like I kind of wanted. But other than that, like I say, I'm so pleased with the final look. The base was kind of a bit of a non-entity. It didn't really require much work from my side of things. I painted the gold around sort of like the rim of the step and those two kind of lines that, you know, decorate the bottom. I kind of delicately dry brushed the gold on there, and then just, again, dry brushed some greys, some earthy tones, some browns. Came together really quick like they always do. You know, my bases never seem to take me as long as the actual model itself, so always kind of nice to have an easy time with those. And then obviously there is the tiny little rat that kind of lays protected underneath Shadowheart's feet. Again, a very straightforward, just a couple of colours, a little bit of dry brushing and texturing, done. So, yeah, I'm really happy with how she turned out. I think that I managed to achieve that kind of that special model that I wanted to. You know, I think just with how perfectly printed this model is and with how fine the detailing is, how fine the sort of like the resolution in the print, there is literally not a blurred line on her. Like, she is so crisp and clean. And it has meant that I've been able to achieve something really quite special. I'm really pleased with how she looks, and she completes the trio magnificently. So despite the trials that I have faced during the course of this project, I am truly thrilled with how she turned out. I think she will stand proudly amongst what I have built so far. And as and when it comes time to sort of making a proper display piece and stuff for them, I think I will look at Shadowheart very fondly, because, like I say, I'm just really, under the circumstances, really proud of what I was able to achieve here. So, but once again, that brings us to the end of another model project. I have one model sort of that you may have seen sneaking around in the background of some shots. I have one model currently here that I'm able to work on, but it's going to very shortly be time to purchase some new models, so, you know, exciting times ahead. But, as always, thank you very much for sticking with me throughout this and watching all the way through. Filming has been a little bit higgledy-piggledy throughout this process simply because of my mental state. I normally have a very regimented approach to it, whereas this time I kind of got ahead of myself and had to re-record stuff. It's been a little bit of a bit of a mess. But thank you all the same for getting to this point with me. I really do appreciate all the feedback and the support. It makes it much easier. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.